All right, so thank you all so much for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about kids who are going to need some extra help next year, kids who might be traumatized, and how educators and school leaders can start to think about these issues when we go back to school. So we're obviously going through a really unprecedented time in this for schools. We had to cancel education services during a pandemic, but also there are a whole lot of other things going on right now in national life, protests happening around the country in response to racism and violent police killings. So a lot of things are happening in the country. A lot of things have been happening in kids' lives, and in many ways, and I think in many places, we don't have a great understanding of what the past few months have been like for our children and what the summer is going to be like for them as well. So I think it's fair to expect that there's going to be some turmoil that children are facing that will show up at school next year. So today we're going to be chatting with Jessica Botiani, who is a research assistant professor in the Curry School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia. Morgan Derby, a special education teacher, and she runs a website called The Trauma Informed Teacher, which focuses on the importance of forming trusting, healthy relationships with students. Antonio Garcia, who is an associate professor of social work at the University of Kentucky, and Akisha Osei Sarfo, who is the Chief Performance Officer at Guilford County Schools. So we're going to talk about how to spot trauma in children and the best ways and most evidence-based ways to deal with these types of situations. So I think it'll be really great. And I think everyone is going to start off by doing some presentations.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thanks to Ms. Derby and Dr. Sarfo and Garcia. It's really an honor to be on the panel with you today. So as Rebecca said, I'm Jessica Botiani. I'm a research professor at the University of Virginia's School of Education and Human Development. And my work over the past decade has largely been in Maryland and focused on racial disparities in school discipline practices. So I think this is the perspective that I bring to this panel, a focus on disparities in discipline by race in particular, and how we can prevent them in the context of COVID-19. And as Rebecca said, I really want to acknowledge first, though, that we're all standing in this moment of crisis and reckoning in our country in the shadow of two pandemics, the dual entangled viruses of COVID-19 and racial violence in America. And what I really want to say is at this moment in time, I don't know the answers. We're in uncharted territory here. And even before the COVID pandemic, our research has been a long way behind in informing meaningful action to address school discipline disparities. Our interventions have been equity neutral often, hoping to somehow create equitable outcomes, but rarely with enough of a theory of change focused on equity, and rarely addressing structural factors that contribute to inequity. So this is a work that we need to do as educational researchers and with some urgency. But since this conference, we're charged to try to answer questions based on existing research and known effective practices. I'm gonna do my best here to make some recommendations and focusing on inequity because we know COVID-19 is a hardship for all children, but for Black, Indigenous, and students of color with low incomes, they're certainly bearing a disproportionate burden of the impact. And we're already seeing that in the data. So now more than ever, conventional school discipline approaches like disciplinary referrals out of the classroom or suspending students from schools aren't going to work and are probably going to cause further harm for kids who are just returning to some sense of normalcy this fall coming back to school. So punitive tactics like exclusion have never been an effective response to student behavioral challenges, and are prone to excessive use, particularly with Black students. And instead, we need to really adopt more equity-focused perspectives and strategies to avoid the use of those discipline tactics in the first place. So first, if you could advance to the next slide. I wanted to start with a core principle of focusing our energy on fixing injustices and not kids. A lot of the time we default to thinking about discipline and behavioral data as a reflection of a problem within students, but that's a trap that can lead quickly to deficit thinking. The idea that students, particularly Black, Indigenous, and students of color, struggle because of internal problems in themselves, their homes, their families, and their neighborhoods. Seeing this a lot in schools and working on this issue a lot in schools. But this type of thinking places a burden of the behavioral challenges that we're seeing squarely within students and their families, and denies the impact and role that surrounding intergenerational and present day structural inequalities and interpersonal biases have on kids. Ibram Kendi, the author of the book How to Be an Anti-Racist, has said that denial is the heartbeat of racism. And we, in the work that I've done in schools, have often come across when we're looking at disparities in discipline data, that denial comes up so often that it's not a problem in their school, or that it's not a problem to do with race. And so striving to be anti-racist means really letting one's defensive guards down and allowing oneself to be vulnerable and looking with clear eyes at the discipline data and what that means about changes that need to be made within the school. It can also free one to focus more on student and family and community strengths and assets that can be tapped as funds of knowledge and resources for learning in schools. So this shift in focus from fixing to fixing injustices and not kids is a first step that I'd recommend. And next one is creating opportunities for connection and building authentic relationships with students. Focusing on relationships, we get to know students, learn what they're experiencing, understand where conditions are falling short of giving them an equal chance at success, and gain insights into their strengths and resources that can be leveraged for learning. This connection also gives us a foundation that can sustain and soften the conflicts that do inevitably come up in disciplinary encounters in the classroom. It can be a lot harder when we're in a remote learning context, which we may find ourselves in with students in the fall again. To have those kinds of connections. And so options for creating connections in remote learning settings can include a number of them. One of them I'd highlight is doing online check-in assessments with kids where you ask them to answer a prompt. Today I'm feeling, and have them check all that apply, whether they're feeling happy or excited, sad, anxious, hungry, tired, overwhelmed, or have them fill in the blank. And these online check-ins then can be used to provide individualized support. But that also brings me to a third recommendation, which is to love your data and use it for good, because these online check-ins can also create data that allow educators to track patterns in student needs and make connections to challenging behaviors at certain times of day or in particular settings online at school. In addition, combining that with paperless approaches to documenting disciplinary challenges can facilitate assessment of patterns and data across classrooms and across the school as a whole, focusing using function-based thinking and database decision-making on the what, where, when, who, and why of these things that are happening in the school building. And in examining those data, it's as important to consider staff needs for professional development and coaching as it is to look at them from the view of what students need. And all of this is implemented most effectively in the context of multi-tiered systems of support in the school. A fourth recommendation is, if we can advance to the next slide, is to make schools softer, not harder. School hardening approaches like camera surveillance and policing and punitive discipline tactics have been linked to students reporting that they feel less safe, less like they belong, and less fairly treated in the school. And so many school districts are turning away from those approaches more and more towards social emotional learning, or SEL initiatives. And this is particularly the case in COVID. I'm hearing from the districts that I'm working with that more and more they're bringing in to their school improvement plans a focus on investing in SEL curricula in their schools. An important caveat with the SEL initiatives is a danger that they could be delivered superficially as just another way of policing school behavior. There's a concern that SEL might be just a way of teaching Black and Brown students how to be polite white. And it's true that we need to teach kids to self-regulate and to be constructive members of society, but we don't have to teach them to regulate to comply to others' standards of their behavior all the time. So working together with youth and empowering them through SEL to co-construct healing spaces that allow for the full expanse of every child is an important focus for SEL delivery. A Black child's anger might not look like a white child's anger, and then a Black child might get disciplined where a white child is not. And so one path away from this is to integrate racial and equity literacy skills for teachers as part of broader SEL initiatives to help address the harmful effects of racism. Equity literacy initiatives like Paul Gorski's and Howard Stevenson's focus on helping teachers gain fluency in recognizing, responding to, and repairing relationships when bias occurs, and creating and sustaining bias-free school environments. The last point I'll make is the need to support staff well-being and growth. School staff and administrators themselves have experienced COVID-19 as a traumatic event and have faced enormous stress themselves in rapidly converting their teaching to a virtual space in the context of their own personal losses and helping students to cope with their losses in this pandemic. So it's essential that educators take time needed for self-care. And lowering teacher stress can actually lead to reduced enactment of implicit biases. So administrators supporting school staff to do so can help with specific strategies around self-care. Administrators can go further too by encouraging staff to move not just from self-care, but also towards self-work. 83% of teachers in the US are white, and the majority are white women. Someone quoted Maya Angelou the other day to me saying, do the best you can until you know better, and when you know better, do better. So for our schools to equitably support all students, including Black, Indigenous, and students of color in the wake of COVID-19, we have to really work towards creating anti-racist learning spaces. And to do that is going to take a lot of self-work, embracing Maya Angelou's call. So thank you.
All right, hi, I am Morgan Derby. I'm a special education teacher, and I was going to talk to you today about the big question of what about student behavior? What are we going to expect with student behavior when we come back to school? So if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, I'll jump right into it. So a lot of times teachers, adults tend to think of student behavior as either being good or bad. They're behaving well, they're behaving poorly. But if we dig a little bit deeper, we actually can realize that a child's behavior can reveal parts of their story without even using any words. And you probably already do this intuitively. You can watch a child and know if they're hungry, if they're tired, if they have to go to the bathroom, if they're stressed out, just by looking at a kid. And so when we take that knowledge and then we apply it to students in our classrooms, and we cover it in the umbrella of what we know about trauma, we can start to unpack our students' behaviors in our classroom. And I know one of the big questions that teachers, administrators, a lot of people always have is this student's behavior due to trauma, or is it due to just normal acting out kid behavior? After the COVID-19 and we can finally come back to school, I think it's safe to say that a lot of behavior will be due to trauma. Even in the most ideal circumstances, there are kids at home who are traumatized just from not being at school and missing their friends and their whole lives getting flipped upside down. But a good way to determine that is if the behavior is anything that is significant negative behavior that is outside the norm for that developmental range or outside of a disability. So it would be totally normal for a teenager to fall asleep in class every once in a while. That is a normal teen behavior. It is not normal to fall asleep every single day, all the time, and have to be woken up when the bell rings because you don't even hear it. It's also, that could be an indicator of trauma. It's also, though, could be related to a disability because it could be related to medication that makes a student tired or some disability they have that can't sleep at night. But when you can go in and unpack that, you can start to determine whether or not a behavior is due to trauma. But after the virus, it is highly likely that students struggling with behavior, it will be due to trauma. So I'll dig into what you can do about that. So do you want to go ahead and go to the next slide? I'll start on that. The very, very first thing is to form strong relationships with your students. If you hear nothing else from this entire conference and you do nothing else, know that strong relationships are the foundation of a trauma-informed classroom. If you do not know your students well and your students don't know you well, you're not going to get anywhere. The rest of this isn't going to make a big difference. Relationships are so important because through the relationships with your students, they learn to trust you. You learn how to read them better. And then from that trust, the rest of this is built off of. So the very first thing is to form strong relationships. I would even advocate when we start school up in the fall, I know a lot of people are really nervous about, do we jump right into academics because there was a big gap from doing e-learning for so long? But I would really caution that and encourage you to spend more time forming relationships, those beginning of the year icebreakers, and little activities that you do in your classroom, and spend more time and concentrate your time in that before jumping into academics. The second step, when you have a student that you know is struggling or you're wondering if their behavior is due to trauma, start watching their patterns of behavior. What are they doing? What is their behavior that they're struggling with? Is it always happening at the same time of the day? Is it always happening during transitions? Or is it always happening on a certain day of the week? Or is it always happening if they sit next to a certain peer or the schedule has changed? One of my students that I had was perfect throughout the week. He was a 5th grade student. And every Friday morning, he would defecate himself and he would refuse to change his clothes. He would refuse to get up out of his seat or go to the bathroom. His parents refused to pick him up from school when it happened. It was a whole huge mess. But on Fridays, he would go from his mom's house to his dad's house on the weekend. And knowing what we know about trauma, we can make assumptions about what was happening. And we did call Child Protective Services and get all of that involved with that. But by Friday afternoons, my classroom smelled horrible. But that was a pattern of behavior that he had. It was just Friday mornings, and then by the afternoon, it was pretty rough. But the next step after you identify the patterns of behavior and the events around it is to explore possible needs that are driving the behavior. So a lot of times we'll think, oh, they just want attention, or they're just acting out, or they just don't want to listen. There is always a deeper reason than that. Students don't inherently want to be a bad kid. They don't want to get in trouble. There are some students that have been traumatized so much and then gotten into trouble that is their comfort zone. But overall, a student doesn't start off wanting to get in trouble. There's always a deeper need driving the behavior. And that need is usually related to trauma. Oftentimes it can be they are looking for a feeling of safety. They're looking for attention from an adult who is safe. They're looking for validation or affirmation. They're looking for someone to tell them that they care about them, that they're important, or that they're worthy. They might even just be trying to meet a physical need. I have a student who sleeps in class often because he lives in a household where there's kids up all hours of the night, and he slept in the living room couch and couldn't sleep. So he fell asleep in class every day because he wasn't getting his physical needs met. So exploring the reasons behind the behavior can also help. And then the very final thing would be to develop and implement ways to meet the students need. So whatever need their behavior is showing, they need validation, they need safety, they need care from an adult. Try to meet those needs within the school day. And it's really challenging. And sometimes it requires quite a bit of creativity. And sometimes you can't do it. With my student who defecated every Friday, there was not much I could do other than just be supportive and be there for him during the school day. But with my student who wasn't sleeping, and I just bought him a pair of earplugs and gave them to him at school to help him sleep at night when his house was too noisy. Sometimes this looks like just showing the student extra attention. That one is usually pretty common. A lot of kids don't get a lot of attention at home, or they get negative attention at home. And so they will ask for attention with their behavior in school. And so a super easy way, it's actually, this sounds like a really nerdy teacher thing to say, but it's actually kind of fun to watch it happen. So when you have a student who's doing, acting out and their behaviors, they're just wanting attention, start to pour on the positive attention. Say their name as often as you can. Use their name in examples. When you're doing a word problem, change the name Johnny to the name Billy to match it up with the student. They'll get this huge grin on their face and they'll start giggling and they think it's so cool. Even in high school, I've taught every grade level and even high schoolers will do that. You can make them your special helper. I had one student in high school, my room was really, really humid. And so every day it would fill the dehumidifier up with water. It was even less than a day. It was his special job to take it and dump it. And this was a high school student who was too cool to do anything else, but he really valued the extra attention he got from helping me with my dehumidifier. So those are the 4 basic steps to working to identify behaviors and then using that data to drive the supports. But if you do want more information, because I packed this into 5 minutes, on my blog, on my website is thetraumainformedteacher.com. I have a series of blog posts called 10 Days of Behavior, where I unpack the 10 most common behaviors that teachers see in a classroom. And I dig into why we see them, what the student might be trying to gain by the behavior, and then strategies that you can use in a classroom. So I would encourage you to check that out if you want to know any more. And that's it.
Good morning. My name again is Antonio Garcia. Thank you all for being here. It is truly a pleasure to be a part of this panel. I come to the table here with a different perspective in that my education, training, and practice has focused on how best to address racial inequities within the foster care and juvenile justice systems. As a former CPS worker, I realized, to no fault of my own or my colleagues, that the child welfare system is ill-equipped to address the intersecting public health concerns that really create the perfect storm for kids of color to enter those systems at a rate far exceeding their Caucasian counterparts. Now, to this day as a professor in social work, I realize that the work must begin upstream in schools where teachers provide a safe set of eyes and ears on our kids. Many of the cases I was called upon to investigate were indeed reported by teachers and principals. Nearly 20% of the 4.1 million alleged occurrences of maltreatment are reported by education personnel. Now, in the midst of 2 pandemics, COVID-19 and racial violence by law enforcement, the lingering question is, who will provide those safe set of eyes and ears? These pandemics and the resulting lockdown and the loss of in-person instruction will likely create traumatic experiences for young kids that teachers will need to grapple with. Even before the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, teachers were challenged on a daily basis to meet the educational needs for 20% of youth who are diagnosed with social, emotional, or behavioral problems. These symptoms are likely due to adverse childhood experiences, including psychological, physical, or sexual abuse, violence exposure, or living with a household member who uses drugs, is mentally ill or suicidal, or have been imprisoned. And we know from prior studies that exposure to ACEs, or these adverse experiences, has significant effects on educational outcomes, including increased risk for learning and behavior problems, decreased engagement in school, and increased enrollment in special education services. These conditions or risk factors and its effects on kids' well-being are likely to be exacerbated by this pandemic, especially for youth and families of color, giving us all the more reason to train teachers in recognizing indicators of trauma and abuse, and in how to make appropriate referrals when they observe these red flags in the classroom. Research can guide these best practices. For example, we know from previous efforts that training school personnel to be trauma-informed is insufficient. Teachers need to not only understand the root causes of trauma, they also need to know best practices for referring students to effective interventions. And mere dissemination of information from leaders to teachers about new innovations or practices is not adequate. For school leaders to support the changes, they too must recognize and embrace the value of innovation and evidence-based practices. Leaders must instill motivation for teachers to screen students for need and encourage them to refer students to evidence-based practices when needed. So if you turn to the next slide, I'll share what I'm doing now to help address some of these gaps. Currently, I am researching how to increase leader, teacher, and staff awareness of evidence-based practices and improve efforts towards initiating and sustaining exchanges of knowledge and information between educators. To achieve this goal, I plan to examine whether my newly developed online training curriculum, inclusive of lectures, role plays, and group dialogue, if they actually increase knowledge and exchange about evidence-based practices in the classroom. The study will also determine if these conversations between teachers and leaders increase awareness and the chances that school personnel actually make referrals to evidence-based practices as needed. The online training would offer flexibility as teachers can complete these trainings in the comfort of their own homes. And when we resume classes, teachers will then be armed with knowledge and resources to respond to the trauma that many students will bring to the classroom. And that's all I have for now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. I'm happy to be here and share my thoughts. So I've done quite a bit of work around discipline disparities here in Guilford County Schools and otherwise. So as a statoid or chief performance officer, a lot of mine is using secondary data. So you guys probably have a lot more insight into the actual practices of discipline. But what I do know is that our Black and Brown students are overly referred and suspended and expelled in our schools. And so I just want to acknowledge that we are standing on Native land and we are sitting in buildings built by slaves, descendants of slaves and immigrants. We are living in a time that is reflective of a history of blatant and systemic racism. And we are living in a time of uprising where the people are sick and tired of being sick and tired. From Emmett Till to George Floyd, it is an American tradition to destroy the Black body. So our children are brought up knowing that their bodies can cause fear and could result in their death. This constant state of fear, coupled with the high levels of poverty in our communities, which we know are direct results of racist policies, lead to cumulative levels of trauma that our children face. So when we look at the data, there's no surprise whether you look at a discipline data point or a performance data point, that schools, performance of students in schools hasn't changed much over the years. Accountability policies, interventions, increased school funding have helped in very incremental ways, but we still see large gaps in student learning. And then looking at even our most recent NAEP results and student performance overall has only changed or improved slightly. The use of early warning systems are useful in identifying students who might be at risk for not succeeding in schools, and including any kind of discipline data in those models can strengthen the accuracy of those systems. But we also know that Black and Brown children experience racism in schools, where teachers and schools perpetuate and impose biases that lead to behavioral and disciplinary infractions. We know that there are uneven and biased implementation of discipline policies in schools, discriminatory discipline practices, implicit biases of educators, and racial mismatches between teachers and students that lead to what we see in the over-referral and suspension of our students of color. We also know that teachers are the most influential factor in changing this trajectory of student learning and success. Yet, research has shown us that teachers of Black and Brown students tend to rate their students, Black and Brown students, in a manner that is consistent with social expectations. And if you've spent any time looking at the news recently, you know that those aren't positive. They also have expectations and rules of Black students that can be controlling and imposing, like empathy with when Black children are exhibiting challenging behaviors or challenging home experiences, and interpret Black students' behaviors as combative or argumentative, and also misunderstanding the meaning and tone of a Black student's or Brown student's verbal or nonverbal language. So while we may include these indicators in early warning systems, you have to understand the inherent biases associated with those indicators. More so, research has consistently shown us that the most significant indicators of a student's long-term success and outcome in schools and life are race and poverty. So using these indicators are not as strong as those of race and poverty. This is not happenstance. This is part of a systemic racist system that keeps Black and Brown children in trauma and in poverty. I have never met a Black boy who wanted to fail. So you can have all kind of indicators in an early warning system, but until you dismantle the practice of racism and bias in schools and in American society, address the social and emotional well-being of our children, and reduce hunger and poverty, we will not close gaps in achievement. What I see in the news today is promising. The world is shifting to see that inequities and poor treatment of people of color, and people are starting to ask questions. As Ta-Nehisi Coates says, an American that asks what it owes its most vulnerable citizens is improved and humane. So hopefully this movement will not die in the next couple of months, but will result in lasting change, long overdue, in how we treat each other, and more so in how students experience school. I can tell you here in Guilford County, we are in the midst of planning for reentry in the fall, and we don't have a clue about what that will look like. We are collecting data on our students and parents about their experiences during the remote learning. But this data will in no way prepare us for what we will see in the fall. We do know that children find schools to be safe places. And so during this remote period, where students are required to stay home, we expect to see higher rates of students who have challenges with dealing with the trauma that they've experienced, not just with the remote learning period, but with the killing of George Floyd and others, as well as just the history of racism in this country. So we are preparing to provide those resources for children in our school. We also are preparing to have a screener, a social and emotional screener that we will administer to our students once they enter in the fall to help gauge some of the needs of our students. But this will require lots and lots of resources in schools to be able to provide students with the resources they need to be able to learn.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. So now we're going to start the Q&A portion of everything. So I'll just ask a question and jump in whenever you feel appropriate. So yeah, we've all mentioned this. There is so much going on in the country right now, and so many heartbreaking things going on in the country right now, in addition to COVID, with the uprisings that are taking place throughout the country in response to racism and police brutality. And I just wanted to open the floor up for how you think that's impacting students potentially.
Well, I'll give it a pass first. I think I just want to acknowledge too that many of us are in a really raw and sort of vulnerable space coming out of the past 10 days following the news of George Floyd's murder, and the subsequent uprisings nationally and globally. So I'm, as a white woman, I don't really feel like I'm in a position to answer this question. I'm going to try, but I think I'll probably shut up pretty quickly. The first thing that I would say is that I imagine that for many Black students, this is an event in another of a long line that continues to cause a huge amount of grief and anguish and touch on a lot of unhealed and unrepaired wounds, and a sense that things haven't changed. So I imagine there's another level of trauma and despair that sort of is caused by this and ongoing. But I also hope that some of the actual response and latest run of media and societal attention to this issue might bring some hope for change. I think each time this happens in our country, these moments of reckoning, more and more people have been hitting the snooze button on it, are starting to wake up. And I hope that will include changes too in our schools to better support Black boys in particular, Black boys and girls in our schools.
Do you guys think that...
It looks like Akisha was about to say something. Sorry.
I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
I was just trying to answer the question. So yeah, so I do think, as I stated in my comments, we're going to see children come in with higher, and not just our Black and brown children, all of our children coming in with higher levels of stress and trauma. I think, but I think that as educators, we need to be prepared and have open spaces to have conversations about what students have experienced during this period of time, and support students as they navigate through what this all means for them now and in the future. But we're used to this, unfortunately, right? So this is not necessarily new. This is just something that that tends to happen at least be exposed in the media every now and then. And so for us, Black and brown children, it's trying to get them through this, but it's also to try and get all students to understand why this is happening.
I think the same thing as Jessica. I'm a white woman talking about this. I'm really not prepared for that. But I think that one of the big things we need to help students address this in the fall is that teachers need training on how to best manage this in their classroom. I know even I live in a predominantly white community, and there will be people who will argue, well, it's not a problem here, we don't need to worry about it. But even here, we need training on it. We need to know how to teach our students the right things to say, how to search for our own implicit biases, and then how to carry that over to teaching our students. Because I think a lot of teachers want to do something, but we don't have guidance on it. So we're kind of just floundering in the dark, hoping, praying, trying our best. And sometimes our best isn't enough to teach it, even if we want it to be. I think training would be really important for this.
And I agree. Can I just piggyback on that? And that's going to take an investment from schools and school districts. We luckily have a race and equity division in our district, and that's been helpful, but even they are understaffed to serve the 73,000 kids in our community, and as well as the teachers and even central office staff. We all need training. I'm not a race expert to be able to deliver that kind of training to my team. So that's going to take an investment from schools and communities and school districts.
And I also just want to underscore that this is new territory for all of us. We're learning as we go here. There are no templates on how to engage youth in having conversations around, racial violence and pandemics. So we're in new territory. So I think we should give ourselves permission to be in that space, but then also think about ways in which we can mobilize our young youth to have voice, to give voice and give them that space to discuss those issues in the classroom and to not brush them off. I think more than now that I think that it's more important to make sure that they again have a voice in this process.
So, you know, we have been talking a lot about training and resources, and something that I've been thinking about and that concerns me is that from everything we're hearing, schools are going to be facing really severe budget cuts in the fall. And I'm just wondering how you guys are all thinking about helping these students and providing these services for students amid these cuts, and how we should be thinking about that.
Well, trying to create a trauma-informed classroom, teachers need training on it. You can't do it just throwing it out there on your own. You need to be trained on how to do it. You need to read books and understand trauma. And schools could invest in that, but teachers can also seek that information out on their own. There are plenty of books you can read. Everything on my blog is completely free because I wanted it to be accessible to everybody. So budget cuts will happen, yes. But can a teacher still view their students through the lens of trauma? Yes. Can discipline still be altered because of understanding trauma? Yes. And that doesn't cost any money. So I think that if teachers and administrators are willing to put work into this, that would be a step in the right direction, even with the budget cuts. But the budget cuts, that's kind of scary and very unfortunate, especially coming back from all of this.
So can I just say that the training should not just be about trauma or trauma-informed classrooms. The training needs to be about looking within and understanding your own biases and how those result in the over-referral, suspension, or any other negative impact it might have on children. That is the training that needs to precede any trauma-informed training. All of us have some biases, and it's just an implicit bias that we have towards certain groups of people, and we need to address those internally first before we can help inform and improve our classrooms.
And part of the training that I'm developing attempts to achieve that goal by modeling how educators, teachers, and principals, and superintendents can engage in those conversations. What does a teacher, or what information does a teacher need to refer the student to an evidence-based practice, rather than engage in, unwarranted disciplinary practices? And then how does someone then take race out of the equation in that process? And that's exactly what I'm trying to achieve here is how can teachers thoughtfully engage in trauma-informed practice, but also be wary of the fact that Black and brown students are more likely to be expelled and suspended, and other outcomes from that. So it's paying attention to some of the institutional and systemic racist practices that have been in place for years now, and coupling that with being trauma-informed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, if I can add to, I couldn't agree more that it needs to not just be trauma-informed, but we really need to be centering equity and not just saying the words, but really helping to move along a concept of equity literacy. It's talking about these things is a skill set that needs to be developed, and training can help, but I think coaching is also so important, not just in building the skill, but in motivating a desire to develop that skill. Certain coaching models like Wendy Rinke's The Classroom Checkup really focuses on motivational interviewing as a strategy to help teachers reconnect with why they wanted to become teachers in the first place. And then drawing on that, helping them find their own self-directed way of changing to create more equitable outcomes. And so in the context of very few resources and less resources than we had even before, I would say let's spend less money on policing the schools. Like, let's spend less money on installing surveillance cameras, and let's spend more money on building out social emotional learning and equity literacy initiatives in the school that really help teachers and students build relationships that they need to feel safe in the school space.
And what are some of the things that you think schools and teachers can start doing right now to be proactive about these things, even if their school is not in session?
Well, okay, speaking as a teacher who just spent the last 3 months doing e-learning, teachers need to take a break. Teachers need to stay in their houses. They need to practice self-care. They need a break because that was awful. But once they take a break, once they are, because teachers were traumatized in this. They missed their students. They completely shifted everything that they were doing. And while teachers are much better as adults, better prepared to handle the trauma of that, there's still trauma in that. It was hard. So first, over the summer while school is not in session, teachers need to take a break. They need to rest. They need to recharge and not think about school all the time. But then I think when they're ready, then I think there's a lot of information that they can start reading on their own. As things in the news seem to progress and we hear worse and worse things, it also seems like resources are becoming more available. It doesn't take much for me to scroll through Facebook and see some horrible news article, but then a few articles down, see a teacher who posted something about different strategies to try, or a new article that would help to shift teachers' mindset. So I think taking a break and then spending some time reading and reflecting on their own practices would probably be a good first and second step.
So can I just add to that? Our children don't get a break. So I understand everybody, I need a break, but the work has to continue to prepare schools for the fall and to make sure that our schools are opening up August 17th. We have to be prepared for these children to come into a space where they feel welcomed, where they feel like they have the social and emotional supports that they need, and where we can provide them with instruction that will close. So if you've seen any of the MAP research, some of our children are going to come in almost 2 years behind grade level. We need to be prepared for these children in the fall. I don't know where the break is. I actually don't think our children don't need us to come ready and prepared.
Yes, I would agree. I would definitely advocate that teachers need to come prepared. But yes, this is hard for everybody, like you said, and it is even harder for the kids.
So to the question of how schools can prepare, I was actually curious to hear more from you, Dr. Sarfo, because I think you said that you all are doing some needs assessments. I'd love to hear more about the ways that you're doing that, the types of questions that are most helpful. That would be interesting to me to hear more about.
Not necessarily a needs assessment. It's a hodgepodge of we've surveyed our students, our parents, teachers, and principals, as well as all of our employees. And some of the questions are geared towards whether just the remote learning experience, And then other questions are geared towards how schools have communicated with parents, what additional supports they received during the remote learning period. It is very remote learning focused. It's not necessarily focused on the new racial climate that we're in. So that's the piece that's missing. And that's why in the fall, we plan to have a screener for students on their social and emotional well-being to help understand how our students have dealt with not just the racial tension that's going on right now, but COVID and everything else they've experienced in the last 6 months or so. But that's one of many things. So, but that's how we're trying to measure and collect data related to it. Yep.
Are you using a screener that you guys have created in your own school corporation, or is it one that you found from an outside source?
So we haven't decided on our screener yet. We don't use one right now, but we're also on the assessment side of things, looking at a new assessment platform because we didn't have like a diagnostic. We need to figure out where our kids are and how much in the fall. And the tool that we're looking at has a screener in it. So hopefully that will work out. If not, there's definitely good ones out there. Panorama has a great one.
Thanks for sharing about that.
I would guess that teachers may be feeling overwhelmed right now. They have to grapple with both curriculum and now trauma. A way to sort of disentangle that is to, of course, make sure that teachers are skilled and trained to recognize symptoms of trauma, but then to also realize that they don't have to address the trauma. It would be helpful if they knew of any resource within the school or the community that can address that trauma. They don't have the bandwidth to actually treat the trauma. They're focusing on 30 plus students in the classroom who, they need, basically this teachers need to make sure that their educational needs are being met. So I think administrators, I would think, would need to think really hard about how to support teachers once they do recognize that trauma is persistent and apparent in the classroom.
I agree. And I think once again, back to investments and resources, every school should have a social worker and counselors, no matter the size. And if larger schools should have more than one. We're very much lacking in the space of providing schools with psychological and social work services. And I also agree with you, Antonio, in the sense that our higher ed schools are not doing a good job of preparing our teachers to teach children who have trauma. And so we do need to work with partnering with higher education institutions to make sure that their curriculum is geared towards addressing the needs of all of our children.
I want to dig more into that idea that higher ed institutions aren't doing a good job of preparing teachers for this. What does the...
Not, I want to clarify.
Not all. No, that's some.
We could do about that.
We could do better. Yeah, explain a little bit more about what some of this preparation looks like right now and the areas where we should be drilling down. Anyone.
Oh, okay.
Anyone who feels comfortable.
So the question is about pre-service education for teachers in higher ed. I think there's some, Morgan, go ahead. I was going to say, I think there's just a very light touch when it comes to culturally responsive teaching. I don't think there's very much at all in the way of talking about equity explicitly in training. And a lot of teachers are, we could do a lot better in preparing teachers coming into the space. Sorry, Morgan, you can probably speak to it better than me as a teacher yourself.
That's definitely one area. Yes, teaching diverse classes and understanding that. working through your own implicit biases while you're still in college before you get yourself in a classroom full of kids, that would be helpful. But also teachers' mental health training for their students, trauma-informed training like we talked about. In any given classroom, teachers have kids who struggle with mental health issues like ADHD and anxiety and depression. In kindergarten, it starts. And teachers a lot of times have no idea, even special ed teachers, that's not always covered in pre-service teacher training. So starting to cover all of those areas in addition to everything else, yes, I think that would be a step in the right direction.
Do you think there is any chance that this moment could change that it will help teachers, that there will be more emphasis on preparing teachers for inequity and analyzing their own biases? Have you seen any talk or movement around that to anyone?
In working with districts, I've certainly seen there already have teachers in the buildings. They're talking about in-service teacher trainings and professional development. There's some models that we've been working on that are one that's designed to teach through professional development, but also through one-on-one coaching, culturally responsive practices to teachers. That intervention has shown some impacts on independently observed teacher practices, best practices in the classroom, and self-reported culturally responsive knowledge. But that intervention, which is called Double Check, principal investigators Catherine Bradshaw, is a starting place, and we've started moving more towards explicitly talking about equity and equity literacy through a new intervention that we're developing in partnership with a school district in Maryland. And that intervention is about, again, working on coaching with teachers, but also embedding equity literacy as a skill set in social emotional curricula that teachers are implementing in their classrooms with kids. And so there's some key concepts around recognizing bias, self-care when a bias incident occurs, determining when you can respond in a safe way. And so if the teachers are teaching the kids that, the teachers need to learn those skills themselves first. And so a lot of the intervention is front loaded around working with teachers through professional development and coaching to recognize those incidents. And the hope is that sort of along the way in their own learning and teaching the kids this, that's something that they're learning themselves in a way that is met with less resistance or defensiveness. So that's a couple of areas that we're focused on within service that I could speak to.
In general, do you guys think that schools are going to be prepared?
No, absolutely not. This is years of damage that has just been compounding on each other. We got 2 months, 3 months. Some people are still in school. Like, that's not enough time to take it. Like, we can try to be prepared. We can take steps towards it, but will we be fully prepared? That'll take years to get to that point.
Yeah, I agree. I think we'll be as prepared as we think we can be prepared. I mean, there's just no way to know what we don't even know what school will look like in the fall, let alone how our teacher or how our students will come back to us. So we'll do the best we can.
And of course, we need the resources. We need trainers to come in and train our teachers around racial equity. We need folks to come in and train around being trauma-informed.
But you can't learn that in the next 2-3 months.
No, that's going to take years. It's going to take years.
Ongoing, yep.
And that's part of the problem, is that the longer it takes, the more money it takes. So there's a lot to sort of wrap our heads around this issue.
And we need good trainers.
Yeah.
So that's a whole nother conversation, but there's a lot of people walking around.
Yeah. And a lot of people,
equity this, but being able to teach somebody how to understand their own biases, how to teach an equity mindset is not easy.
Right. And a one day training is not going to work. It has to be on an ongoing basis, because usually like you said, it takes years to unravel those biases, and it takes a number of trainings to unveil what those are too.
In practice, I think I agree so much. It's like these, done in a day kind of approaches don't work. It needs to be ongoing, and it needs to be supported with opportunities for practice and growth in the classroom, feedback, and an ability to kind of respond and continue to develop the skill set.
So. It's not a matter of just getting information, but then how do teachers and educators process it? And then how do they, after they process it, how do they then move to action? And that takes years.
Yeah, where the rubber hits the road.
You have to have leadership that believes in this work in order for it to filter down into the schools and the teachers. So not just the superintendent, but the board has to understand why this work is important in order to invest in it and to make it part of the culture of schools.
And I think that right now, even the trainings that I've sat in on, and even the trainings that I've been a part of, teachers are so overwhelmed that teachers see a need for this. They see a need for training on implicit biases and trauma-informed teachers and all the things. But then, and they take it and they sit there and then they stand up from the training and they're like, yes, I can do this. We're going to do this. We're going to try it. I see it's important. And I got some, and then they walk into their classroom the next day. And all the other millions of things hit them that are just part of a normal traditional classroom. And I think that have smaller class sizes where teachers are stretched less than, would also go a long way to speeding this process up. Because teachers are going to have more of the headspace to be able to try new things in their classroom. They will have more of the space to reflect. But when you throw a teacher into a classroom of 30 different kids with 30 different backgrounds and dozens and dozens of issues that need addressed quickly or immediately, it is very overwhelming to try to take what you just learned in a training and apply it in a classroom when class sizes are so large.
And on that note, we need social workers. We need social workers to support the teachers. We need social workers who are trained in evidence-based practices to respond to trauma. You're right, teachers can't do this alone. They need that support, and our students need that support.
For Morgan and Akisha, those of you who are working in districts, have you been hearing it all from your families? And if so, what are the types of things that they've been telling you?
It's all over the place. So we have a very diverse community here, very affluent parts of our communities, and then very poor and even migrant populations here. It just depends on who you talk to. We are setting up 2 new virtual schools because we are concerned about student attrition due to COVID. Students and families not feeling that it's safe or healthy for them to return to school. So we've just submitted applications for 2 new virtual schools, one for elementary, one for middle high. So that will address some of those concerns in terms of the health and safetyness of schools. But we get all kind of comments. We have all kind of, and so that's just from our Let's Talk and our board meeting comments that I know about, because we still have our parent survey out there and our student survey out there to understand a little bit more about how parents are feeling about returning back to school in the fall.
I don't have any official data because the surveys that our school gives out go to administrators, and I'm a special ed teacher, so I don't get that. But I do know a lot of the parents that I've talked to in our area are ready to go back to school. They want to go back to school. They want school to be normal. E-learning was a struggle for them. It was a struggle for their kids. And I think a lot of people in this area are hoping for as much of a return to normalcy as we can.
And Jessica and Antonio, what are some of the things that you're thinking about from an academic perspective that you're going to be looking at or curious about and focusing on?
Well, one of the, as I mentioned earlier, I'm focusing on developing an online training for teachers and principals. And the trainings would focus on, how to recognize trauma, how to have conversations around how to refer students to evidence-based practices, and to eliminate some of those biases that we've been talking about. So that's one piece. And I think a larger piece around that is how, moving forward in academia, how can researchers and professors work towards establishing or developing and maintaining those connections with schools. I think there needs to be a better feedback loop between our local schools and our universities. Many of us in the ivory tower, so to speak, may think we know what needs to happen, but we need to go back and talk to our educators. They are the experts. They know what the issues are. They know what the concerns are. They may have ideas about how to proceed. As researchers, we can evaluate. We can partner with them in determining whether or not what they're doing is effective. But I think there needs to be more meaningful engagement between universities and schools.
I would certainly agree with that. On our end, we are doing sort of active, or were, and hope to begin to get back into schools and be doing active intervention work with teachers on culturally responsive teaching and equity-focused teaching practices. I think one of the challenges that we've seen in a systematic literature review that I have done, and just kind of a work with colleagues around the country, is a barrier for us in knowing whether or not these interventions are effective, is that we don't have very good measures of cultural responsiveness or of equity literacy. When you ask teachers about their practices, there's a social desirability bias problem, because we all know what we should be doing, or maybe we have a sense of it, but it's hard to really feel that those answers are totally forthcoming, especially when teachers might feel that those surveys are evaluative or that they could be used against them in some way. We are developing an observational measure, trying to train observers to go out into classrooms and provide sort of a non-evaluative look at what's going on in the classroom, and use those data to help teachers to kind of see and work through and improve their culture responsive practices. But then there's the issue that our observers are coming from different backgrounds, different perspectives, and they need training themselves in understanding what culture responsive practices look like and what equity practices look like. And then we've, in a third way, looked at asking students how they feel in the classroom, if they are recognizing a cultural responsiveness or equity sensitivity in their teachers. And that's a little bit more possible, I think, with older students, but it's really a challenge with younger students, and really discerning what's the difference between what's just good teaching and what's truly equity focused and culturally responsive is a challenge. So a lot of my thinking is around measurement of how we are measuring, we're improving things, and that is because we want to develop interventions that really are making a difference in improving things, and so we need to have those measures in order to really discern the impact that we're having.
And what do you all think, and this is admittedly a bit of a selfish question, but what are the things that you feel like, the media isn't talking about enough, that isn't being brought enough to the public's attention, that there just needs to be more attention brought to at large?
In relation to part of
in relation to what schools are going to be facing?
I think it would be great if the media worked on relaying to parents that we are trying our best and that we may not be as fully prepared as we would like to be, but to be patient with us come fall. And then for them to be cooperative when we try and collect data from them, to give us their feedback so that it can help inform, exactly, Jessica, so that it can help inform how we enter in the fall, because without their information and feedback, we can only do what we think is best.
Anyone else?
Speaking just from a teacher's perspective, the media portrays a lot of things about teachers, but I think one that they're leaving out is just exactly what teachers have done in the last few months, how hard it was, how we had 2 hours notice in my district that we were going to be going home and not coming back to school for a while. And we weren't allowed back in the building. So like we had to get our stuff and get out, and it was very quickly. I know other districts had a little bit more time, but I think, and this whole session has basically been even more of teachers should do this and teachers should do that and schools should do this, and we're asking even more of teachers. Most of us know we're not going to be able to go back in August or September and start school like we would normally do every year. Teachers who've taught for a while tend to have a set plan that they do, procedures they follow in the beginning of the year, especially when they're teaching the same grade level again. And a lot of that is going to get thrown out the window. And I think that there's not enough discussion on how much we're expecting teachers to do, especially in relation to teacher pay. That does get brought up in the media, but we're asking teachers to do a lot and we're cutting the budget. That doesn't make sense.
And in general, before we wrap up, are there things that we didn't touch upon that you guys just want to make note of and put out into the ether about this topic? Any closing thoughts?
I would just say that, and maybe this is an answer to the last question too, but we need to diversify. Our teaching workforce is definitely a big piece of this puzzle. And it's one that really does take years and forethought, but that pipeline needs investment and attention, because we can't really improve our schools, I don't think, until teachers and administrators are really representing the students that they're serving in the classroom. So I guess I would leave on that note.
One of the things that I would like people to start thinking about, especially when they go back to school in August, is really looking at alternative forms of discipline. I know a few of us touched on that in our first 5 minutes, but I want to make sure we end with that too. Punitive discipline, taking away recess, the color charts, move them up and down, go to, like, no. Just no. Something else. There are creative solutions to discipline. There are ways, really the way that I talked about with identifying behavior and trying to meet the need of the behavior, you can really do away with most traditional forms of discipline just by doing that, because you'll eliminate the need. You'll eliminate the need driving the behavior and then eliminate the behavior. I think one of the things that I would really like to see are the traditional punitive discipline practices. See you later. Goodbye.
So I think I will leave with two things. One is for us to go into the schools, whether you're in higher ed or in the district's office, spending time in schools with teachers, with students, helps inform the work. So I'd start there, and then as well as just making sure students and teachers and everyone understands the systemic racism in this country and why the root causes as to why we see disparities in outcomes and amongst our students and their learning and just discipline and any other, take a data point, why you see such large gaps between our Black and Brown students and their white counterparts.
And I'll just leave with just doing our best to make sure that all of our stakeholders, from our, our teachers and principals, our parents, others in the community, that they all have buy-in in terms of how we proceed. If there isn't buy-in, whatever we do, it's not going to work.
Awesome. Well, if that's it, I think we'll wrap up. I so appreciate all of you coming and discussing these tough but such important issues. I think it was really fruitful and I really appreciate it. And with that, I'll just say that there is a lunchtime Twitter town hall after this for people to join if they're interested. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.